Your Highness, Your Excellencies, fellow guests, and Al-Dabi, who is something else. Al-Dabi, you're amazing, a 9-year-old who I want to invest with, and I hope you're able to let me mentor you. She and I are here to talk about the great transition, principles to guide us through it, and of course, capital. After all, this is an investment conference, and I'm a global macro investor, so we should talk about what investments will give us the best returns. To begin in this session, I will talk about the biggest and most important things. In other talks in the conference, I will get more into the more immediate and more granular stuff, but the big things are what I want to bring forward here. To learn my most important principles for global macro investing, I studied all the major markets, economies, and countries over the last 500 years and thought about how they worked. If you're interested in my in-depth examination of that, you can get my book or my more entertaining video, which is called Principles for Dealing with the Changing World Orders. But you don't have to do that in order to get the punchline, which is that without a doubt, the best capital to invest in is human capital. All good investments come from people who are productive. And the best places to invest are those that have environments that enable those people to be productive. More specifically, history has shown that there are only 2 things a society needs in order to be successful. The first is the ability to provide a good education to most people that teaches them skills and civility so they can be productive. In other words, the development of human capital from the start. This teaching typically comes from parents and teachers who instill good values and principles to be productive with others. The second is an environment that gives people the resources that they can be productive. At its best, that environment provides financial capital that comes from investors, banks, and capital markets to invest in those who are capable of being productive. This environment must be a civil place to live, work, and raise one's families, ideally one in which there are many exciting people doing many exciting things, so that it is a creatively stimulating environment. In other words, having the right people in the right environment that supports productive creativity throughout the life cycle is what it takes. That's why I look forward to discussing these things and also in investing and mentoring others. There's a life cycle of an individual, so I want to just touch on that for a bit. To me, the life cycle of a typical individual looks like this. In the first phase, you learn and you're dependent on others who guide you, most importantly, your parents and teachers. This is the phase that Al-Dabi was in. In the second, you work and you work with others and you try to make others who are become dependent on you successful. This is the phase when work-life challenges become the greatest because you want to be successful at work and successful in taking care of your family. This is the phase that most of you are in. Then there is the third and final phase when you are free to live in peace and free to eventually die in peace, ideally knowing that you did your best to contribute to the evolution process that started an eternity before and then will go on way beyond you. In this phase of life, you are free. You are free of your obligations because you are beyond working to be successful. And you're free of your family obligations because your children have become independent adults and your parents have passed away. I'm in this phase, and I found that it is natural and rewarding to pass along what I've learned in symbiotic relationships with those who want to learn, like Al-Dabi. That is why I mentor and why I'm here today. That is what I believe is the most important thing to do in that phase of life. I have seen that the most important events in almost all life cycles transpire in a pretty scripted way, and the biggest differences in people's lives come from how they handle these things. For example, most children are born, then they are raised by parents, then they go to school, and they're taught by teachers, and then physically and psychologically they change to become young adults and eventually graduate from school, get married, and raise children, and so on until they die. Of course, people who are born into very different circumstances, that gives them very different advantages and disadvantages. But when we see how and where people end up, it's clear that whether they end up in the best possible places or the worst possible places, given where they started from, depends on the choices they make. It is also true that while individuals going through life can know ahead of time the experience that they're probably going to encounter, they can't know exactly what going through that experience is going to be like until they go through it. However, they can get good guidance and good principles for dealing with them from those who have successfully gone through them before. That is why mentoring is so important. To navigate this life cycle well, it's important to know where you are in that life cycle, where the people who matter to you most are in their life cycles, and then seek out good principles for dealing with the most important things that will be coming at you and them. I suggest that you look and see where you are and what's likely to come over the next 10 years, which you probably can pretty well visualize by seeing how the typical life cycle goes and also modifying the picture for your own circumstances. You can gain good principles from dealing with most of the things that are going to come at you because they happened to many people before in many lifetimes before. And good principles are available from many wise people who have successfully gone through these things. So now let's talk about the life cycle of a country. As for all good environments, for all good environments that are essential for people living up to their potentials, there are countries, leaders who have to provide these things. In other words, the environments are provided by the country's leaders. History has shown that good leaders have good principles that provide the two essential ingredients that I mentioned earlier. In other words, education and the resources to be productive. These lead to societies flourishing. And history also showed that leaders who fail to provide these things have failed societies. However, because each leader is limited to one lifetime, and great societies exist over several lifetimes, great leaders also must pass their good principles on to their successors, who employ successfully these principles and improve on them over several generations. If they can do that, great cultures will naturally develop in which people abide by these principles, and that makes societies work well. Looking back, we can see who the great leaders were and what their great principles were. For example, Sheikh Zayed and his successors obviously have deployed great principles because they used them to shape Abu Dhabi to the place that has brought us here today. Consider that the majority of people who live and work in Abu Dhabi are from other countries and are here because the things that they want most are more reliably available here than in their own countries. I've been coming to Abu Dhabi for over 30 years, So I've seen it change a lot without seeing, and I've seen the principles behind its success evolve, but not much. They were the same basic principles. There are timeless and universal principles for making a great country. The story of Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore is a similar story. These are the Renaissance states like Florence, Venice, Lisbon, not to be confused with the great powers who control the world order. These are the states that successfully navigate between the great powers to prosper. Abu Dhabi is a classic Renaissance state. Now let's turn our attentions to how the world order is changing. History shows us all world orders and all great powers have multi-generational, archetypical life cycles that transpire for logical reasons. To explain them, I'm going to show you a 4-minute clip from a 40-minute animated video that I mentioned called Changing World Order. It'll be in this animation. I hope you'll bear with me.
I studied the 10 most powerful empires over the last 500 years and the last 3 reserve currencies. It took me through the rise and decline of the Dutch Empire and the guilder, the British Empire and the pound, the rise and early decline in the United States Empire and the dollar, and the decline and rise of the Chinese Empire and its currencies, as well as the rise and decline of the Spanish, German, French, Indian, Japanese, Russian, and Ottoman empires, along with their significant conflicts, as measured in this chart. To understand China's patterns better, I also studied the rise and fall of Chinese dynasties and their monies back to the year 600. Because looking at all these measures at once can be confusing, I'll focus on the 4 most important ones: the Dutch, British, US, and Chinese. You'll quickly notice the pattern. Now let's simplify the form a bit. As you can see, they transpired in overlapping cycles that lasted about 250 years, with 10 to 20-year transition periods between them. Typically, these transitions have been periods of great conflict because leading powers don't decline without a fight. So how am I measuring an empire's power? In this study, I used 8 metrics. Each country's measure of total power is derived by averaging them together. They are education, inventiveness and technology development, competitiveness in global markets, economic output, share of world trade, military strength, the power of their financial center for capital markets, and the strength of their currency as a reserve currency. Because these powers are measurable, we can see how strong each country is now, was in the past, and whether they're rising or declining. By examining the sequences from many countries, we can see how a typical cycle transpires. And because the wiggles can be confusing, we can simplify it a bit to focus on the pattern of cause-effect relationships that drive the rise and decline of a typical empire. As you can see, better education typically leads to increased innovation and technology development, and with a lag, the establishment of the currency as a reserve currency. You can also see that these forces then declined in a similar order, reinforcing each other's decline. Let's now look at the typical sequence of events going on inside a country that produces these rises and declines. In a nutshell, the big cycle typically begins after a major conflict, often a war, establishes the new leading power and the new world order. Because no one wants to challenge this power, a period of peace and prosperity typically follows. As people get used to this peace and prosperity, they increasingly bet on it continuing. They borrow money to do that, which eventually leads to a financial bubble. The empire's share of trade grows, and when most transactions are conducted in its currency, it becomes a reserve currency, which leads to even more borrowing. At the same time, this increased prosperity distributes wealth unevenly, so the wealth gap typically grows between the rich haves and the poor have-nots. Eventually, the financial bubble bursts, which leads to the printing of money and increased internal conflict between the rich and the poor, which leads to some form of revolution to redistribute wealth. This can happen peacefully or as a civil war. While the empire struggles with this internal conflict, its power diminishes relative to external rival powers on the rise. When a new rising power gets strong enough to compete with the dominant power that is having domestic breakdowns, external conflicts, most typically wars, take place. Out of these internal and external wars come new winners and losers. Then the winners get together to create the new world order, and the cycle begins again.
As conveyed in that clip, it appears that the world order is approaching a difficult transition period of the sort that we have seen many times throughout history. This doesn't mean that the world order necessarily will be painful or difficult. The times that we have ahead still depend on how we are with each other. History also shows that even if the world does have the worst of times of this sort, that what was experienced in the past, that there are still places and experiences that have peace and prosperity and are good places to be. In fact, history shows that even during the worst wars, those in the neutral, productive countries did exceptionally well. For these reasons, there are always ways to have peace and prosperity. It all depends on how we are with each other. Just as there are always some people in places that are bad, there are always some people in places that are good. You just have to find them, go to them, and be good in them. When considering your investments and investment environments that you want to be in, which are for all purposes, the purpose is to give you the lives that you and your family want, I believe that these are the most important principles to follow. In one sentence, what's most important is how we are with each other. I wish you a good conference, and I look forward to discussing these items with you. And to conclude, I will conclude this session with my partner, Al Dabi. Bring her back, please.